I always thought I knew exactly what my life was going to look like. If you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have told you I was one of the lucky ones. I had a great job in logistics that paid well enough for me to buy a nice 3-bedroom house in the suburbs of Austin, a beautiful wife who still made my heart skip a beat after 4 years of marriage, and a best friend who had been by my side since our freshman year at Ohio State. I felt like I had checked all the boxes. I had the American dream wrapped up in a neat little bow, complete with a manicured front lawn and a charcoal grill on the back patio. But looking back now, I realize how fragile it all was. It's terrifying how quickly your entire reality can unravel, how a single decision, one tiny choice made out of kindness, can pull the rug out from under your feet and leave you free-falling into a nightmare. It all started on a rainy Tuesday in October when Ben called me. Ben wasn't just a friend. He was the guy who knew where all my bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. We had survived terrible college apartments, brutal breakups, and the chaotic hustle of our 20s. He was the brother I never had. So when he called me, his voice cracking and sounding completely defeated, I immediately sat up straighter at my desk. He told me his tech startup had officially gone under, taking his life savings with it. And to top it all off, his landlord was evicting him because the building was being converted into luxury condos. He had nowhere to go, no savings left, and his pride was completely shattered. Without even consulting Sarah, my wife, I told him right then and there to pack his bags and come stay with us. I told him our couch was his for as long as he needed it. When I got home that evening and told Sarah, she wasn't thrilled, but she understood. She knew how much Ben meant to me. Sarah is a graphic designer, a creative soul who thrives on order and aesthetic harmony. So the idea of a grown man invading her carefully curated living space was definitely a hard pill to swallow. But she loved me, and because she loved me, she agreed to let him stay. We set up the finished basement and the living room couch as his personal zones, and for the first couple of weeks, things actually went surprisingly well. It felt a little bit like college again. We'd crack open a few IPAs after work, watch the NBA games, and order pizza. Ben was incredibly grateful, constantly apologizing for taking up space, and always offering to help around the house. He washed the dishes, mowed the lawn, and did whatever he could to not feel like a burden. But as the days turned into weeks, the dynamics in the house began to shift in a way that I couldn't quite put my finger on at the time. I work long, grueling hours as a senior logistics manager, often leaving the house before the sun comes up and not returning until long after it sets. Sarah, on the other hand, works mostly from her home office. With Ben suddenly there all day, searching for remote consulting gigs and nursing his wounded ego, they started spending a massive amount of time together. It began innocently enough. They would share a pot of coffee in the morning, discuss design trends, or complain about the Texas heat. Then it turned into shared lunches. Ben would cook something for the two of them, or they would drive down to the local taco truck together. I remember coming home one Friday evening, absolutely exhausted from a brutal week of dealing with supply chain delays. I walked through the front door, expecting Sarah to run up and greet me like she usually did. Instead, I heard roaring laughter coming from the kitchen. I walked in to find Ben and Sarah standing close together by the island, cooking a complex pasta dish. Sarah had a glass of red wine in her hand, her face flushed with laughter, and Ben was gesturing wildly as he finished telling some joke. When they saw me, the laughter suddenly died down, replaced by a strange, heavy awkwardness. Sarah immediately stepped back from the counter, her smile turning into something polite and contained. She asked me how my day was, but it felt like I had just interrupted a private party in my own home. I brushed the feeling off, telling myself I was just tired and projecting my own insecurities. After all, this was my best friend and my wife. They were just bonding, which is exactly what I had wanted. But the subtle changes kept accumulating, like drops of water slowly filling a bucket. Sarah started dressing differently around the house. She stopped wearing her oversized sweatpants and messy buns during the day, opting instead for cute sundresses and carefully applied makeup, even on days when she had no client meetings. When I asked her about it, she just laughed and said she was trying to feel more professional to boost her productivity. Then there was the way they communicated. They had developed these little inside jokes that I wasn't a part of. A word or a phrase would be uttered at the dinner table, and they would lock eyes and smile, leaving me sitting there like a stranger at my own table. I started feeling like a guest in my own house, the guy who just brought home the paycheck while the real life of the home happened without him. The real shift, the one that should have opened my blind eyes, happened in early December. I noticed that Sarah had become strangely protective of her phone. She used to leave it lying around on the kitchen counter or the coffee table without a care in the world. Now she carried it face down everywhere she went, even into the bathroom. Whenever a notification popped up, she would glance at it with a sudden intensity and quickly type out a response. One night, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from an unsaved number, but the preview just said, "Can't stop thinking about what you said earlier." My heart did a weird, uncomfortable flutter. When she came out of the bathroom, I casually mentioned that her phone had buzzed. She practically lunged across the bed to grab it, her eyes wide with a flash of panic, before she smoothed her expression and said it was just a demanding client. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. I started losing sleep. I would lie awake in the middle of the night, listening to the quiet hum of the central AC, looking at my beautiful wife sleeping beside me, and feeling this toxic, corrosive doubt eating away at my stomach. I felt like a monster for even suspecting anything. Ben was the guy who had held my hair back when I drank too much in college. He was the guy who stood next to me as my best man at our wedding, giving a speech that made half the room cry about how lucky I was to find a girl like Sarah. And Sarah was the woman I had promised to grow old with. They wouldn't do that to me. It was impossible. I was just stressed from work. I was letting my anxiety get the better of me. To overcompensate for my growing paranoia, I started trying harder. I bought Sarah flowers for no reason, planned surprise date nights, and tried to be more present when I was home. But every time I tried to initiate intimacy or closeness, Sarah seemed distant, her mind miles away. She would smile, but her eyes were cold, searching for something else. Whenever the three of us were in the room together, the tension was palpable. It felt like a rubber band stretched to its absolute limit, waiting for the slightest movement to snap and cut us all to pieces. Ben began avoiding eye contact with me, turning his attention to his laptop or his phone whenever I entered the room. The easy, brotherly banter we had shared for a decade had completely evaporated, replaced by a stiff, formal politeness that felt entirely artificial. Then came the third week of December. My company was finalizing a major shipping contract with a partner in Dallas, and my boss told me I needed to drive up there for a crucial 2-day conference. I was supposed to leave early Thursday morning and stay overnight at a hotel near the convention center, returning late Friday afternoon. When I told Sarah about the trip, I noticed a subtle, momentary relaxation in her shoulders. It was so brief that anyone else would have missed it, but I had become hyper-aware of every single movement she made. She smiled and told me it was a great opportunity, telling me not to worry about anything at home and that she and Ben would manage just fine. That comment, delivered with such casual nonchalance, sent a chill straight down my spine. As I packed my duffel bag that Wednesday night, the air in our bedroom felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone, completely detached from my departure. I kept waiting for her to say she'd miss me or to ask me to text her when I arrived. Nothing, just the cold blue glow of the screen illuminating her face. Downstairs, Ben was uncharacteristically quiet in the basement, avoiding the traditional goodbye handshake we always did when one of us went out of town. I went to bed that night with a sickening knot in my gut, a heavy, suffocating weight that told me everything was about to change, even if my rational brain was still screaming at me to stop being crazy. I didn't know it yet, but the life I had spent years building was about to be burned to the ground. I woke up at 4 a.m. on Thursday with that heavy, metallic taste of dread in my mouth. The bedroom was pitch black, saved only by the faint green glow of the digital alarm clock on my nightstand. Beside me, Sarah was buried deep under the duvet, her breathing slow and perfectly even. I stood there in the dark for a long time, just watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her shoulders, wondering how someone who used to be my entire world could suddenly feel like a complete stranger. I quietly grabbed my duffel bag, crept down the stairs, and let myself out into the crisp, chilly Texas morning. The drive up Interstate 35 to Dallas usually takes about 3 hours, and I spent every single mile of it trapped in my own head, staring at the taillights of the semi-trucks ahead of me while the radio played static. The conference itself was an absolute blur of corporate jargon, fluorescent lights, and bad catered coffee. I was physically present, sitting in a generic hotel ballroom with a badge clipped to my button-down shirt, but mentally, I was thousands of miles away. My mind kept looping back to my own house. I kept picturing Sarah and Ben alone in the kitchen, sharing the space that I paid for, laughing at things I wouldn't understand. I tried calling Sarah during the lunch break around noon. It went straight to voicemail. I texted her a couple of hours later, just a casual, "Hey, just checking in, hope your day is going well." It took her 3 hours to reply with a short, clinical response. "Great, super busy with a client deadline. Have a good dinner." No emojis, no warmth, no miss you. It felt like a text you'd send to a coworker you don't particularly like. By the time the first day of meetings wrapped up around 5 in the evening, the knot in my stomach had grown into a full-blown internal fire. The rest of the logistics team was heading out to a steakhouse downtown to celebrate the new contract, and my boss practically ordered me to come along. I went, but I was a ghost at the table. I ordered an old-fashioned, then another, hoping the bourbon would numb the persistent, nagging ache in my chest, but it only made my thoughts sharper and more aggressive. Every laugh at that table felt mocking. Every time someone asked me a question about shipping volumes or quarterly projections, I had to force my brain to fire up just to give a coherent answer. I looked around at my colleagues, men and women who had normal, stable lives, and I felt completely alienated from them. Around 9 o'clock, my boss clapped me on the back and thanked me for the hard work, announcing that since we had finalized the parameters of the deal ahead of schedule, the morning sessions on Friday were officially optional for the senior staff. We just needed to sign some digital paperwork in the morning from wherever we were. The moment those words left his mouth, something inside me snapped. I didn't want to stay in that sterile, lonely hotel room in Dallas. I didn't want to spend another night tossing and turning on a king-sized mattress, wondering what was happening 3 hours south. I wanted my bed. I wanted my wife. I wanted to look Ben in the eye and convince myself that I was just being a paranoid, psychotic idiot. I didn't even go back up to my hotel room to grab my bag. I left it there, figuring I could pay the fee or have a coworker bring it back over the weekend. I walked straight out of the restaurant, into the chilly parking garage, and got behind the wheel of my truck. The clock on the dashboard read 9:42 p.m. when I hit the highway. The drive back down to Austin was a blur of adrenaline and dark highway. The headlights of oncoming traffic flashed past like warning beacons, but I didn't slow down. I kept my foot pressed hard against the accelerator, the engine roaring as I pushed 75, then 80 miles an hour down the empty interstate. I didn't play any music. The only sound in the cabin was the heavy, ragged sound of my own breathing and the wind rushing past the windows. The entire drive, I played out scenarios in my head, desperately trying to construct an innocent narrative. I told myself that I would walk through the front door, Sarah would be surprised and thrilled to see me, and Ben would be downstairs playing video games. We'd laugh about my sudden impulsiveness, open a bottle of wine, and the suffocating cloud that had been hovering over my marriage for months would finally evaporate. I clung to that fantasy like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. I needed it to be true, because the alternative, the idea that the two people I trusted most in the entire world were actively destroying me, was something my brain simply refused to process. I pulled into our quiet suburban neighborhood just after midnight. The streets were completely dead. The neat rows of houses, dark and silent under the amber glow of the street lamps. As I turned onto my street, my heart began to hammer violently against my ribs, a chaotic, painful thudding that made it hard to breathe. I turned off my headlights a block away from the house, letting the truck coast silently along the curb until I pulled into the driveway. I didn't use the automatic garage door opener. The loud, mechanical grinding of the door would have echoed through the entire house, and for some reason I couldn't quite explain, I didn't want them to know I was there just yet. I wanted to see my home in its natural state, undisturbed by my presence. The house was dark, except for a soft, warm light bleeding through the blinds of the living room window. I stepped out of the truck, closing the door with a gentle, deliberate click that barely made a sound in the midnight air. Walking up the concrete pathway to the front porch, the world felt entirely surreal, like I was moving through heavy water. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my keys on the welcome mat, the metallic jingle sounding like an explosion in the dead silence. I froze, holding my breath. waiting to see if anyone had heard. Nothing changed. The house remained still. I picked up the keys, picked out the brass deadbolt key, inserted it into the lock, and turned it with agonizing slowness. The lock disengaged with a faint, solid thud. I pushed the heavy wooden door open an inch at a time. The familiar scent of our home hit me immediately. The expensive vanilla candle Sarah loved, the faint aroma of the cedarwood floors, the smell of laundry detergent. It was the smell of my sanctuary, the place where I was supposed to feel safest. But the air inside felt heavy, thick with a strange, suffocating secrecy. I stepped into the foyer and closed the door behind me, carefully ensuring the latch didn't click. The house was dead quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the dining room. I stood in the darkness of the entryway for a full minute, letting my eyes adjust to the shadows. The soft light I had seen from the driveway was coming from the kitchen island, where a single designer pendant lamp was dimmed down low, casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. As I moved past the stairs toward the living room, my foot caught on something soft lying on the floor. I looked down. It was Sarah's favorite silk robe, discarded carelessly on the bottom step. A few feet further down the hallway lay a pair of men's jeans. Ben's jeans. A cold, paralyzing numbness washed over me, starting from the back of my neck and spreading rapidly down to my fingertips. My brain completely stalled, refusing to connect the dots that were laid out in front of me in stark, undeniable clarity. It was like looking at a horrific car crash and not understanding what the twisted metal meant. I felt detached from my own body, like an actor watching myself perform a scene in a movie. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just kept moving forward, drawn by a sick, magnetic force toward the living room, my bare socks making absolutely no sound against the floor. The living room couch, the very couch I had offered to my best friend out of the goodness of my heart, was partially obscured by the shadow of the large brick fireplace. But as I rounded the corner and stepped into the dim perimeter of the kitchen light, the scene opened up before me, shattering my life into a million jagged, unfixable pieces. There, in the muted glow of the single lamp, were Sarah and Ben. They weren't just talking. They were completely wrapped up in each other, a tangled mess of limbs and blankets on the cushions, entirely oblivious to the world around them, and entirely oblivious to the man who had built the roof over their heads. The world didn't tilt. The ground didn't open up to swallow me whole. Instead, everything just became incredibly, horrifyingly sharp. In the dim amber glow of that single kitchen light, every detail was burned into my retinas with the force of a branding iron. I saw the empty bottle of expensive Cabernet we had been saving for our anniversary, sitting on the coffee table. I saw Sarah's silver wedding ring resting carelessly on the coaster next to it, casting a tiny, mocking glint under the lamp. And I saw them. My wife, the woman whose hand I had held as we bought this very house, and Ben, the man who had given a toast at our wedding about lifelong loyalty, completely tangled together on the fabric of my couch. They were so entirely lost in each other that they didn't even notice the temperature in the room drop when I stepped inside. They were whispering, those low, breathless murmurs that are reserved for private, stolen moments, followed by a quiet, soft laugh from Sarah that cut straight through my ribs and wrapped tightly around my throat. It was a laugh I hadn't heard in months, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness that she used to give only to me. Hearing her give that sound to him in our home while I was supposed to be 3 hours away in a lonely hotel room was the exact moment the final thread of my old life snapped. I don't know how long I stood there in the shadows at the edge of the kitchen island. It could have been 10 seconds. It could have been 10 minutes. Time completely lost its meaning. My hands were clamped tightly at my sides, my fingernails digging so deep into my palms that I could feel the sharp sting of breaking skin, but I couldn't feel anything else. I was entirely numb, paralyzed by a level of betrayal that was so massive, so absolute, that my brain simply couldn't find the language to process it.
I felt an overwhelming wave of nausea rise in my throat, a sick, acidic burn that made me want to drop to my knees and scream until my lungs burst. But I didn't make a sound. I just watched. The silence was shattered not by me, but by the floorboard beneath my right foot. As I shifted my weight, trying to steady my trembling legs, the old oak plank gave a sharp, distinct creak. In the dead quiet of the midnight house, it sounded like a gunshot. Ben froze instantly. His shoulders went rigid, and his head snapped toward the darkness of the hallway where I was standing. For a second, his eyes scrambled through the shadows, trying to make sense of the silhouette blocking the light. Then he saw my face. The blood completely drained from his skin, turning him sickly, ghostly pale in the dim light. He scrambled backwards so fast, he knocked over the empty wine bottle on the coffee table, sending it clattering loudly against a hardwood floor. Sarah let out a sharp gasp, clutching the blanket to her chest as she turned around, her eyes wide with a mixture of annoyance and confusion that instantly morphed into absolute paralyzing terror when she realized who was standing there. "Chris?" Her voice was a tiny, pathetic squeak that barely carried across the room. She looked at me like she was looking at a ghost, her lips trembling, her hands shaking so violently that the blanket slipped from her fingers. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The three of us were locked in a horrific, silent tableau, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the dining room suddenly sounding incredibly loud, like a countdown timer marking the end of everything. I looked at Ben, my best friend, the guy who had lived on my couch, eaten my food, and accepted my charity while actively, systematically destroying my marriage. He couldn't even look me in the eye. He stared down at his hands, his chest heaving as he tried to find words that didn't exist. "Get out," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was low, raspy, and entirely devoid of emotion, sounding more like a mechanical recording than a human being. Ben finally looked up, his eyes frantic, swimming with a sickening mix of guilt and self-preservation. "Chris, man, listen to me. It's not what it looks like. We didn't mean to." "Get out of my house, Ben," I repeated, stepping forward into the full light of the kitchen. The sheer, cold fury radiating off me must have been terrifying, because he instantly slammed his mouth shut. He didn't try to argue anymore. He grabbed his jeans from the floor, scrambling into them with a desperate, clumsy panic, nearly tripping over himself as he tried to pull them up. He didn't even bother to look for his shoes or his shirt. He grabbed his wallet and his keys from the kitchen counter, gave me one final, terrified glance, and sprinted out the back door, into the cold night air, the screen door slamming shut behind him with a loud, echoing crash. Then there were two. Sarah was crying now, heavy, silent tears streaming down her pale face as she sat huddled on the edge of the couch, looking incredibly small and broken. The sight of her used to bring out every protective instinct I had. Whenever she wept, my immediate reaction was to hold her, to protect her from whatever was causing her pain. But looking at her now, I felt absolutely nothing but a vast, empty void. The woman sitting in front of me wasn't the girl I married. She was a stranger who had worn my wife's skin while tearing my heart out of my chest. "Chris, please," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I am so sorry. I am so, so sorry. It was a mistake. It just happened. We didn't mean for any of this to happen, I swear to you." "It just happened?" I asked, the numbness finally giving way to a white-hot, blinding anger that rushed through my veins like gasoline. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up her wedding ring, holding it up between my thumb and forefinger. "Did this just happen to slide off your finger, Sarah? Did he just happen to live here for months while you two laughed at me behind my back? Did you just happen to text him from our bed while I was sleeping next to you?" She couldn't answer. She just shook her head, her body racking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. She reached out a hand toward me, trying to touch my knee, but I stepped back, as if her skin were made of poison. The rejection hit her like a physical blow, and she slumped back against the cushions, looking completely defeated. "How long?" I demanded, my voice rising for the first time, echoing through the empty, cavernous house. "How long have you been sleeping with my best friend in my own house?" It only started a few weeks ago," she whispered through her tears, her voice barely audible. "I was lonely, Chris. You're never here. You're always at work, always focused on the company, always gone. He was here. He listened to me. He made me feel seen." The sheer, unalterated audacity of her words felt like a knife twisting in my gut. She was blaming me. After everything I had done, after working 80-hour weeks to pay for the mortgage on this beautiful house, after opening my doors to a man who had nothing, she was turning her betrayal into a consequence of my flaws? The anger inside me threatened to spill over, to turn into something violent and destructive, but I forced it down. I clamped a lid on the boiling cauldron of my rage, because I realized, with a sudden, devastating clarity, that arguing with her was completely pointless. The damage was done. The woman I loved was dead, and the marriage we had built was nothing but ashes. I looked around the living room one last time, at the carefully selected furniture, the framed photos of our vacations on the mantelpiece, the life we had meticulously constructed over 4 years. It all felt like an elaborate, expensive set piece for a play that had just ended in disaster. Without saying another word, I turned my back on her, walked down the hallway, and headed out the front door, leaving Sarah alone in the dark with the wreckage of our life. The cold night air hit my face like a physical slap as I walked out onto the driveway. The Austin suburbs were still completely silent, wrapped in that eerie pre-dawn stillness where everything looks gray and lifeless. I got into my truck, my hands shaking so violently I could barely guide the key into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, the dashboard clock read 12:48 a.m. I didn't have a destination. I just pulled out of the driveway, leaving the headlights off until I hit the main road, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that house as humanly possible. I drove aimlessly for hours. I watched the neon signs of gas stations and 24-hour diners flash past my windows, a blur of red and amber light that matched the chaotic, burning noise inside my head. Every word Sarah had said kept looping in my brain, a cruel, mocking soundtrack to my sudden eviction from my own life. He made me feel seen. The phrase tasted like copper in my mouth.
I had sacrificed my sleep, my health, and my sanity working to build a future for us, only for that sacrifice to be weaponized against me. I felt a profound, suffocating sense of foolishness. The signs had been there for months. The changes in her wardrobe, the locked phone, the shared laughter in the kitchen, and I had actively chosen to blind myself to them because the alternative was too terrifying to face. By the time the sky began to turn a bruised, paled purple in the east, I found myself parked in an empty lot overlooking Lake Travis. I turned off the engine and just sat there, listening to the ticking of the cooling radiator. The sun rose slowly, casting a brilliant golden light across the water, but it brought me absolutely no warmth. I felt completely hollowed out, like a building that had been entirely gutted by fire while the exterior walls remained standing. I took my phone out of my pocket. There were 17 missed calls from Sarah and a dozen long, rambling text messages filled with apologies, explanations, and pleas for me to come home so we could talk. There was nothing from Ben, not a single word. The brotherhood we had shared for over a decade had vanished into thin air, replaced by the cowardly silence of a man who knew he had committed an unforgivable sin. I didn't reply to any of her messages. Instead, I called a number I had saved in my phone a year ago when a colleague of mine went through a brutal divorce.
It was a high-end family law attorney downtown. When the receptionist answered at 8 a.m., my voice was completely steady, cold, and detached. I scheduled an appointment for that exact afternoon. The next 3 days were a masterclass in emotional survival. I checked into a generic business hotel near the highway, a sterile room with beige walls and a window that overlooked a parking lot. It was the perfect backdrop for my new reality. I refused to let myself cry. I refused to let myself fall into a pit of self-pity. The blinding rage that had consumed me in the kitchen had hardened into something much more dangerous, a cold, calculated determination to protect myself and salvage whatever dignity I had left. When I met with the attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Elena, I laid out the facts without an ounce of emotion. I told her about the house, the bank accounts, the investments, and exactly what I had witnessed on my living room couch. She looked at me with a mixture of professional assessment and genuine sympathy. She told me that Texas is a technical no-fault divorce state, but that a judge could absolutely consider fault, including adultery, when dividing our community property. She told me to secure our finances immediately. I left her office and went straight to our bank.
Sitting at the glass desk of a branch manager, I legally split our joint savings and checking accounts down the middle, moving my half to a brand new, entirely separate account that Sarah couldn't touch. I revoked her access to my credit cards. Step by step, file by file, I began the agonizing process of surgically removing myself from the life we had shared. It felt like tearing a bandage off a raw, open wound, but every cold administrative action gave me a twisted sense of control. They had taken my trust, my marriage, and my best friend, but I was damned if I was going to let them take my future. On Sunday morning, 4 days after the confrontation, I finally drove back to the house to pack my essentials. I had texted Sarah an hour beforehand, telling her in no uncertain terms that she needed to be gone when I arrived. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was missing. The front door was unlocked. Walking into the house during the daylight was entirely different from entering it in the dead of night. The sun was streaming through the large living room windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The couch had been meticulously cleaned, the blankets removed, the wine bottle gone. It looked like a normal, beautiful suburban home, but the air was completely dead. The silence was heavy and suffocating, filled with the ghosts of the people we used to be. I went up to the master bedroom and grabbed 2 large suitcases from the closet. I packed my clothes, my shoes, my laptop, and my important documents. I didn't touch anything that belonged to her. I didn't touch the framed photos on the nightstand or the mementos from our trips. As I was walking down the stairs with the heavy bags, my eyes fell on the kitchen island. Sitting on the dark quartz counter was a small white envelope with my name written on it in Sarah's neat, artistic handwriting. I paused at the bottom of the steps, the weight of the suitcases dragging down my shoulders. For a long, agonizing moment, I wanted to leave it there. I wanted to walk out the door and never look back. But the morbid curiosity, the desperate need for closure, won. I dropped the bags, walked over to the counter, and tore the envelope open. Inside was her wedding ring and a single sheet of paper. The note was stained with dried tears. She wrote about how deeply she regretted everything, how she had broken off all contact with Ben the moment he ran out the back door, and how she would do absolutely anything to earn my forgiveness. She begged me not to throw away our 4 years of marriage over a mistake born out of loneliness and confusion. She swore she still loved me, that I was the only man she had ever truly envisioned a future with. I held the note in my hand, reading her desperate words over and over again, waiting to feel something, waiting for a spark of grief, a pang of regret, or even a flicker of the love I had carried for her for years. But there was nothing. The well was completely dry. Her words felt hollow, like the empty promises of a child who was only sorry because they had finally been caught. She didn't love me. You don't systematically destroy the person you love. You don't let their best friend climb into their bed, sit on their furniture, and mock their sacrifices if you love them. I took the note, folded it neatly back into the envelope, and slid it into my pocket. It wouldn't be used for reconciliation. It would be handed directly to Elena on Monday morning as a physical piece of leverage. I picked up her silver wedding ring, the band that represented the vows she had so casually shattered, and tossed it carelessly into the trash can beneath the sink. I grabbed my suitcases, walked out of the front door, and locked it behind me for the very last time. As I drove down the familiar tree-lined street of my neighborhood, I looked in the rearview mirror at the house growing smaller in the distance. The American dream I had chased so passionately was gone,
reduced to a legal dispute and a pile of broken promises. But as I hit the highway and merged into the afternoon traffic, a strange, quiet sense of peace settled over me. The betrayal had nearly killed me, but the blindfold was finally off. I was completely alone, heading toward an uncertain, completely unwritten future. But for the first time in months, I was finally driving in the light.